Hi, I'm Helen Besant and welcome to the webinar for the second specialist unit of the HR pathway for the Advanced Diploma in Strategic People Management. So what we're going to be looking at is 7HR02, and that's resourcing and talent management to sustain success. So the aim of this particular webinar is first of all to just have an overview of the unit, then move on to look at how the unit is assessed, and then finally I'll go into a little bit more detail about the requirements of an assessment at this level of study to hopefully provide you with a little bit more guidance in terms of what you need to be doing when you attempt each assessment question. So when we look at the assessment, the one that you need to be looking at is the newly released assessment brief for this particular unit, and that you can see the ID on the screen, and it was released in June 2024. So that's the assessment we're going to be looking at, and that's the questions that I'm going to be looking at now. So this unit then, it focuses on the practicalities and strategic issues associated with resourcing within organisations to maximise the performance of staff and the organisations themselves. So that's the focus. You look at the unit in a little bit more detail in terms of the specification in the separate unit specification, which I'm sure your centres will make available to you. So this particular unit consists of 4 separate learning outcomes, and each outcome has 4 assessment criteria. So in total, for this particular unit, there are 16 assessment criteria, each with their own indicative content, which again you can find within the unit specifications for all of the units, but in particular for this one. So when we look at how the unit will be assessed, you will need to answer 4 separate questions that will be approximately 1,000 words each, with a total word count of 4,000 words, plus or minus 10%. And each of the questions will be assessing your knowledge and understanding across all of the 4 learning outcomes. What is important is when you're attempting each of the questions, please demonstrate for each answer which outcome and assessment criteria are being cited. So for example, if you're doing question 1, put a little head in question 1 and then the outcome and the assessment criteria. That just makes it clear as to which question you're attempting. It's also important to consider the audience and the context of the question. So you will find that in the actual assessment brief. So for this particular assessment, you're leading a working party to review the organisation's resourcing talent strategy. So it's a strategic audience and it's a senior audience. So bear that in mind as well, and also think about the context that the questions are set within. It is essential that when you come to answer the assessment questions, that you are then relating them, when asked, to your own organisation or one which you're familiar. And a lot of the questions will ask you to relate them to the organisation. That organisation will be either the organisation you currently work for or one you're familiar with. So it might be one you've previously worked for, but they do need to relate to an organisation, because you've been by able to do that, you're demonstrating your understanding of the subjects, and you'll be able to apply them to a business and a people context, so they don't they then don't remain abstract and theoretical. So we do need to see application of that knowledge to demonstrate your understanding, but to actually apply it to a people and a business setting. So when asked, if you are asked to relate to your own organisation, the assessment questions will ask you to do that. It's very important that you actually doing that. So moving on to look at the questions themselves then. So the first question is asking you to analyse one external and one internal factor that is shaping the organisation's resourcing and talent strategy. Recommend how this strategy could be improved to respond to these factors. So in the first instance, then we're looking at a question that's got almost two parts. So you're looking at what's actually shaping the organisation's resource and talent strategy. So you're looking at one internal factor and one external factor. So you need to look at analysis of that. So it's not a description, it's an analysis. So remember to elevate your answer. So you're making sure that you are analysing those factors. So it's why those factors are shaping the organisation's resource and talent strategy, how they're affecting it, what are the implications of that, and so on. So it's more than a description of. And then, having completed the analysis of those factors, then recommend how this strategy could be improved to respond to those particular factors. And again, make sure that the analysis and the recommendations that you make do respond and relate to your organisation, and make sure as well that you're fully justifying those recommendations that you're making. And that justification comes from referencing your wider reading, but also thinking about the business impact and implications of the recommendations that you make. And then moving on to question 2. This also has two parts. It's asking you to make 2 justified recommendations as to how the organisation can improve the effectiveness of its employee induction programme and propose how its effectiveness can be evaluated. So the first thing you're looking at is how making 2 justified recommendations, how your organisation can improve the effectiveness in employee induction. So when you're looking at making those recommendations, again, use your wider reading, and you almost need to look at what makes induction effective in the first instance before you can actually make recommendations to how to make it more effective. So for your wider reading, you'll be able to examine what effective induction looks like, to then be able to recommend how your organisation's induction programme needs to actually be improved. And then also then propose how its effectiveness can be evaluated. And again, use your wider literature to support your response, but also making sure that you're relating it to the organisation and how it's going to actually impact the organisation, how it's going to, and think about the stakeholders as well, and how it's going to impact those. And then question 3. That's looking at workforce planning. Is focusing on workforce planning to further enhance the organisation's workforce planning, evaluate a short and a long-term approach that could be implemented to meet the current and future demand for talent, providing justification for what each would be appropriate. So this really does need you to think strategically, because you're looking at strategic workforce planning for your organisation. So you need to consider what the organisation's current demand for talent is and what its future demand for talent is, and then be able to actually look at and evaluate a short-term approach to meet that demand and a long-term approach to meet the future demand for talent. Again, using your wider reading to inform your answer, and also to be able to justify why that particular approach is going to be appropriate to deal with the short-term demand, and then for the future, the other proposal in terms of how that approach would be suitable to meet the long-term demand for talent. So quite, as I said, quite a fairly straightforward question, but that is one that is particularly going to show your level of strategic thinking in understanding in the first instance what those demands for talent are, to be able then to evaluate and justify two different approaches to meet those demands. And then finally then question 4. This is focusing on performance management in your organisation. So within the context of the organisation, which would be yours, evaluate 2 contemporary methods that utilise technology to manage both individual and team performance. So you're looking for 2 contemporary methods. So contemporary methods means they need to be current, they need to be up-to-date methods that are using technology to manage both individual and team performance. So it's important that you consider both the individuals and the team, and that you don't spend all your time looking at one and then just briefly look at the other, or we don't want the other one ignored. So it's important that you are, when you're looking at those methods, that you are actually looking at how they are going to manage both individual and team performance. So that's where you're asked to evaluate 2 contemporary methods. So that evaluation is looking at, you know, what would potentially work well, what wouldn't work so well with both for your particular organisation. This is where again it's important that you're relating the your response to either your organisation or again one that you're familiar with, but it does need to be related to an organisation. And then I think if we have a look at how your assessments are marked, and I think when you attempt any assessment, it's important to keep in mind what the marking criteria are. So at this level of study, there are 6 main marking criteria, and as you can see on the slide, I'm going to just go over an overview of these, and then I'll go into them in a little bit more detail. So first and foremost, then, your response needs to be focused. It needs to respond directly to the question asked, and it needs to show depth and breadth of understanding. So try not to just be superficial in your knowledge. You do need to show that you've accessed a number of sources, and that you've actually, from your wider reading, that you do have a depth and breadth of understanding of the subject area, and that you can apply that then strategically. So that's where you're trying to raise above just describing, but you're actually looking at how you're going to analyse, how you're evaluating the particular, if it's a proposal or recommendation, for example, that you're thinking about providing what is strategic and professional advice. So it's remembering that this is a professional business qualification. You do need to, throughout all your assessment answers, be evidencing that you conducted research and you conducted wider reading to inform all of your answers, and you need to reference throughout. It's important and essential at this level of study that all answers are evidence-based. And then you use in that wider reading to form original and persuasive responses to the questions. And then think about how you're justifying your recommendations, making sure that you're doing that and the presentation of your work is clear and professional. If you have a look then at the marking criteria in a little bit more detail, this grid is included within the each of the assessment briefs. You can see on the left-hand side the generic grade descriptors, which are the main marking criteria, and then it gives you a breakdown then of the kind of the standards you need to achieve to gain a pass, a merit or distinction. So I think that also is a good guide to use, and keep referring to that or bear that in mind when you're attempting your assignment, your assessment answers. And then finally, then, as some additional guidance for you, I'm just going to expand really on those assessment criteria and the marking criteria, is really to try and support you and guide you into trying to get those higher grades, because there are specific essential requirements when you're studying at level 7. So first of all, when we were thinking about focus, please ensure really that you're clearly planning your answers. Think about what's the main points I need to make? How am I going to make my arguments? How am I going to structure my arguments so that you plan a clear, direct response to the questions? It is so easy to go off on a tangent and go down a bit of a rabbit hole and lose sight sometimes of what the question is asking. So make sure that you remain focused and that you have a clear structure to your answer, and that you are responding to all parts as well, that you're not missing anything, because some of those questions have got multiple parts. So, make sure that all parts of a question have been addressed. I mentioned about showing your depth of knowledge and understanding. That is going to come from making sure that you're showing some analysis of the subject areas, and that when you're applying them to a particular organisation, that's going to further show your level of understanding as well. So your knowledge is a given, you must be demonstrating that, but there's far more than demonstrating your level of knowledge that is required. It's important also to apply some strategic thinking and adopt a business-focused approach. So thinking about, particularly when you're making recommendations, that you're thinking about strategies and not describing necessarily a process, but you're thinking more at a holistic level, and that you're thinking about that whatever you're going to propose, for example, is going to impact not just improving maybe induction, which is what we're looking at, but what would be the wider implications of that. So you're taking a more kind of the big picture approach when you're addressing each of the questions. It's important also, linked into this and demonstrating knowledge understanding, that you're responding accordingly to the command verbs. So try not to be overly descriptive in your answers. When you're asked to critically evaluate, you need to demonstrate critical thinking. You need to think, well, this would work well, but there are some downsides to this. So, there are pros and cons to things. And then analysis is where you like doing a kind of a more of an investigation and analysing and unpicking something. So I know that your centres will guide you as to and help you understand the requirements, but this is a reminder of it's really important that you are demonstrating your critical thinking, your abilities to evaluate and analyse, for example. As I mentioned earlier, you do need to ensure that you're demonstrating that you've conducted wider reading and that you're using that published literature to inform all of your answers. So the expectation is that you're going to be referencing sources, and they must be appropriate sources all the way through your assessment answers. Now, appropriate sources are sources that have been written by experts in their field. So not using blogs or generic websites or sources such as LinkedIn, for example. They are not considered appropriate, they're not considered credible or reliable. So please make sure that you're really thinking about the sources that you're using. A lot of people like to use books, but if you haven't got access to books, you might have access to Google Scholar. The CIPD Knowledge Hub is just got so much research reports on it that would be relevant to this and many of the other assignments, the assessments that you're actually going to complete. There's academic databases such as EBSCO, again available via the CIPD Knowledge Hub. If you're going to use EBSCO, well, I would suggest you use the advanced search, because it allows you to narrow your search down a little bit more. For example, you can look at timeframes, you can look at certain parts of a research journal, and it just saves you a bit of time. It's a bit more effective when you come to try and do your research. If you're looking for organisational case studies, you can look at publications such as the People Management publication that you should all get, and you can go by the CIPD website. You can get to their archive section of People Management, and you can go back through all of the back copies of the publication. So that can be really useful. So that's just some examples of where you can look for appropriate sources. There's just so much available to you. And then you're using that reason to develop your answers and your original arguments. So an original argument isn't just your own thoughts, they are your thoughts, but they're what you have determined based on your readings. So, for example, source A, B, and C have said this, that, and that. You synthesize and analyze that, and then you will actually paraphrase that, referencing back to those original sources. So it's not, you're not writing literature reviews, but you're trying to write an original response to and original arguments based upon your wider reason, and then by referencing to those published sources, that you're actually supporting the arguments and the points that you're making. And then think about the presentation of your answers. You're not being asked to write essays, you're responding to questions. So think about how you can best structure the answers, and you might want to use headings, subheadings to highlight perhaps the main sections or the main points that you're including in your answers, and that then it helps you to stay focused as well, and you've got a clear then defined structure. And then finally, please adhere to the CIPD word count policy. We mentioned earlier it's the 4,000 word assessment, plus or minus 10%, but make sure that you're familiar with the word count policy, of what's included and what isn't included, because it's important that you stay within that, because if you're under or over the word count, the word limit for that particular assessment, then your work can't be marked. So it's really important that you familiarise yourself with the actual word count policy before you actually attempt the assessment. And finally then, as we draw the webinar to a close, I really hope that you enjoy this particular unit. I'm sure you find it fascinating and you'll gain a lot from it. And I hope also that you've enjoyed the webinar and that you find it useful. If you have, well then there are a series of other webinars for the core units and for the other specialised units as well. So thank you all for listening, and I wish you well.